If you've ever watched a speedrun, you're likely familiar with seeing a timer present on screen that shows how fast the runner is completing a particular game. This is known as real-time attack, or RTA for short, as opposed to using an in-game timer, which is known as IGT. IGT timers aren't common for speedruns because of problems they typically have, such as flaws with the timer's accuracy, the conditions for when it's designed to track time, and performance issues with how it runs, which can be affected by the use of glitches, bugs, and even the hardware itself. Today we'll be exploring some of the communities that primarily use IGT as a timing method to get an understanding of why it's used over RTA, as well as looking at cases where games have switched to alternative methods of timing and the problems that arise from doing so. But before we look at keeping competitive integrity intact, let's talk about how this video's sponsor, NordVPN, can help protect your data's integrity online. NordVPN is a service that protects your online activity by encrypting your data and hiding your IP address, which keeps it safe from prying eyes. But that's not all it can do. Recently, I started watching Fullmetal Alchemist and was disappointed when I saw that it was no longer available in my country before I had a chance to finish it. But with NordVPN, all I had to do was connect to a server in a country where the series is still available, and I was then able to continue watching it from where I left off. Sometimes while researching videos, I get directed to websites that display a ton of annoying pop-up ads, but NordVPN has me covered with its built-in threat protection that not only stops you from getting spammed with ads, but also keeps you safe by scanning any file you download. Start using NordVPN today with its risk-free 30-day money-back guaranteed by using my promo code at the link below. And with that, let's get into the video. The first game we'll be looking at is Metroid Prime, which has been using an in-game timer since the very first speedrun 20 years ago. So let's see what it has to offer. Prime runs at a fixed frame rate of 60 FPS, and the game engine will always advance the game's logic at a fixed time interval per frame based on the assumption that it's running at 60 FPS. This works out to 16.666 milliseconds per frame, but for simplicity's sake, we'll treat it as 16. If the hardware is unable to render the game at 60 FPS, the entire game will slow down, including the timer, which stops it from desyncing if lag is encountered for whatever reason. The timer itself only has two conditions for advancing. The player camera isn't being controlled by a cutscene, and the game is not paused, which includes looking at the map screen and reading a finished scan point. Essentially, any time that the player has control of Samus, the timer is advancing. Because its rules aren't overly complicated, there aren't any known exploits or glitches that will affect the accuracy of the timer. If a frame passes during gameplay, the IGT is increased by 16 milliseconds, which means from the time you start to the time the cutscene of the Metroid Prime dying plays, the timer is tracking you frame by frame, with one exception. When the game transitions between cutscenes, the player has control of Samus for one frame, which means the timer counts this towards your final time. Across the entire run, a total of 3 extra frames are added to your count because of this, which isn't significant when you consider that the world record has 240,600 frames. There have been arguments made to convert Metroid Prime to an RTA method, but one of the barriers to this is that an RTA timer would be running during the cutscenes, so by default, records would be slower. The bottom line with Metroid Prime is that the in-game timer is accurate and only counts the frames that you're controlling Samus, which gives it built-in advantages over an RTA timer that would make runs objectively slower. Current high-level runs also aren't optimized enough to where milliseconds need to be counted, but what about a game that has a built-in timer that's exploitable? If you're a longtime viewer of the channel, you're likely familiar with Mario Kart 64 and some of its more prolific shortcuts. But one thing we've never looked at is the timer, because it has some very interesting quirks. Unlike the Metroid Prime timer, which is almost the gold standard for IGT, the MK64 timer suffers from something known as rounding error. All this means is that under certain circumstances, the timer will round incorrectly, and coincidentally, it rounds down instead of up, meaning that faster laps can be achieved by exploiting the rounding error. How the error occurs is tied to the frame rate and how the developers store data when coding the game. It's quite technical, and if you want an in-depth explanation, check out this post by Abney. For now, let's look at how it can be exploited. The rounding error occurs at a very small decimal place, and fortunately for runners, the timer doesn't run into any issues until it reaches 2:08. So a lot of laps are safe from any form of rounding error, except for long laps like Rainbow Road and the setup for some shortcut fast laps. The current Rainbow Road fast lap record is 1:56.15, and since fast laps are driven on the second lap, players can encounter the rounding error if they waited until 2:08 and would save about 0.06, but no one is doing this currently. For long laps, this doesn't affect much since the level of optimization isn't near the limit, but for shortcut laps where glitches are used to set very low times, the rounding error can make a big difference. Let's look at Donkey Kong Jungle Parkway for an example. This task by Forest64 on DKJP shows a lap time of 2:89, which would be a 2:90 if he hadn't waited on the first lap for the rounding error to come into play. Again, this doesn't save any frames, it just skews the timer slightly, but the rounding error does accumulate the longer you wait, and it's actually possible to get a lap time of 0 seconds. And for this reason, it's currently banned to wait for longer periods of time before executing a lap to stop players from shaving entire seconds off of a time. For non-task shortcut laps, if we look again at Rainbow Road, we see players waiting on the first lap before starting their attempts, and they've all tied the human task with times of 16:03. So while it may be an exploit of sorts, it's not something that gives a competitive advantage, and its use benefits everyone. But what about when timer quirks allow for advantageous play? If we look at Devil May Cry from 2001, we see that it has a built-in timer, and the community used it until 2017. So why did they switch? The timer is only active after seeing a mission start screen, so screens where you're buying abilities and items between missions aren't counted, which led to runners approaching these screens in a more relaxed manner. But this can be forgiven, as there are other games that do the same thing. But unfortunately, this wasn't the only issue. After Mission 7, the game lets you backtrack through the castle, except once you start this section, the timer is paused and doesn't resume until you enter the door to begin the second fight with Phantom. Aware of this fact, runners would take this opportunity to farm materials useful to the run at no penalty to their final time. But the current world record holder, Maxylobes, felt very strongly that this was against the spirit of speedrunning, so he began presenting arguments to the mods that this no penalty farming should be banned. It was put to a community vote, and the practice was banned from future runs, and eventually, another vote was held that switched the game from using IGT to using RTA to ensure that players had to play every part of the game as fast as possible. It's clear from these two examples that Devil May Cry benefited by switching to RTA, as it ensured competitive integrity and eliminated issues with the timer. But what about a case where new strats can be introduced by switching from IGT to RTA? For that, we need to turn to Pokemon. Pokemon Red and Blue speedruns originally used the timer at the end of the run as the final time, but in 2016, they changed to using RTA. So why the switch? The IGT standard was a carryover from the days when Speed Demo's archive made the rules for speedrun submissions, and they preferred runs that used IGT because they thought it would be more accurate than RTA, but the Pokemon timer had problems. It rounds final times down to the nearest minute and doesn't display seconds, so world record ties that weren't really ties could happen. It doesn't start timing until you gain control of your character, so you could spend however long naming yourself, and the rules required players to do runs single segment, which meant that they weren't allowed to save and quit or power off. With the switch to RTA, rules were changed to allow save and quits, which now brought RNG manipulation into play, as previously it was only possible for a task to manip RNG from power on. So runners now had a way to add consistency to high variance sections early in the game. For Pokemon, the switch was made because of inaccuracies in the built-in timer and to improve the quality of life of the speedrun by smoothing out some heavy reset points early on. But what about when an RTA timer is created to track only in-game time and not loads? For that, we need to look at the Soul series. The games in the Soul series are unique examples where players have special timers that only run when you're actively controlling the character. These timers were created to address some problems with the in-game timer, so let's take a look. The special timer came into existence originally for Dark Souls 2 to address problems with how the game's built-in timer worked. Mainly that it was so inconsistent that it was possible for it to display a time longer than what would appear on an RTA timer if you started them at the same time. This was mainly due to hardware and something called VSync, which is a feature that should limit the game's performance to 60 FPS. But sometimes the frame rate would go over this limit, which means the game's speed was increased, so the timer would slowly become inaccurate. To fix this issue, a load removal tool that ran on RTA timing was introduced to create fairness between players running on different hardware. It worked by removing load times automatically from the game to standardize the timing methods, so even if you took a few extra seconds to load a screen, you wouldn't be penalized. For Dark Souls 2, the timer only stopped on loading screens, so if you performed a save and quit, the timer would still run while on the main menu. But other Souls games deviated from this rule set and stopped the timer while you were on the main menu as well, which was mostly because of the discovery of skips that required a quit out. If we look at Elden Ring, we see that quitouts are allowed and that they also run using a special timer called Modified In-Game Time, or MIGT for short. MIGT is a mod that uses code injection to fix the timing issues with the in-game timer, as like Dark Souls 2, Elden Ring's timer can run faster or slower, depending on the frame rate. On top of that, the game is notorious for having lag spikes, and an RTA timer that doesn't count loading time wouldn't be accurate either, since it would keep running during the lag spikes. But the MIGT timer fixes this issue, and ensures that only the frames being ran by the engine are counted towards your time. The MIGT timer is as close to the standard that Metroid Prime set as you can get, but it didn't come without issue. As mentioned earlier, Elden Ring allows quitouts, but unlike Dark Souls 2, the timer doesn't increment while on the main menu, so quitouts can be done without incurring a large penalty to your time. This allowed for situations where you can potentially string together quitouts to get through dangerous parts of the game safely without taking a massive time loss. But this concern isn't a large one within the community for a few reasons. First, if you're saving and quitting, you're losing a small amount of time performing the menu, so you will be slower than someone that runs through the crowded area without getting hit. So while it may be easier to quit out in heavy traffic areas, it's not faster. Second, save and quits are integral to wrong warp glitches, so removing them from the run would effectively kill the any % category as it stands, which is currently beaten in just under 7 minutes by the fastest players. For Elden Ring, it ultimately breaks down like this. The in-game timer is no good because it is wildly inaccurate, and a straight-up RTA timer isn't feasible because load times vary from person to person based on their hardware. The MIGT timer solves both of these issues, but introduces the problem of quitouts potentially being abused. Straight-up banning quitouts also removes the ability to perform integral skips for the run. But if you're fine with quitouts, then there's no issue, and the MIGT is a great solution. The use of IGT and special timers comes on a case-by-case basis. With Metroid Prime, it makes sense to use the in-game timer due to its accuracy and design to pause during cutscenes. But with a game like Pokemon, the switch was necessary due to how bad the timer actually was. The only gray area that really exists is when it comes to load removers. Some people will see the use of multiple quitouts in Elden Ring as an exploit or going against the spirit of the rules, and I think that's a valid argument. But there are valid reasons for using them as well, such as the quality of life improvements they offer and the elimination of hardware differences. So to answer the question, should in-game time be banned in speedrunning? The answer is it depends, as sometimes the in-game timer is perfectly fine and has advantages over RTA. But in cases where it's obviously broken, changes need to be made so that fairness is maintained across competition. Let's also not forget that one of the oldest speedrunning communities in existence operates exclusively with IGT and have developed a system that has kept competition going to this day. If they ran on RTA timing, the prestige of an untied world record just wouldn't be the same, so RTA precision isn't always the best for competition. Ultimately, it will come down to what best serves the community, and if you disagree with any of the examples covered today, I'd love to hear about it down below. And if you enjoyed the content, consider supporting me on Patreon, as I post updates and behind-the-scenes content there regularly. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video, which I'm sure you'll find smashing.